This video is sponsored by Atlas VPN. The year is 1919. World War I has ended in the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, and now vultures circle its corpse. Armies from the United Kingdom, Italy, France, and even Greece have landed on Anatolia's shores. Inside of the empire, Greeks and Armenians rise up hoping to secure independent states for themselves, while nationalist Turks rise up hoping to limit or even topple the Sultan's government and replace it with their own. Although it had surrendered to the Allies, the Ottoman government wasn't helpless. The armistice did not require an immediate demobilization, so they still had an army of 900,000 men. Assigned to lead them in the east was the 38-year-old Mustafa Kamal. In spite of his young age, he already had an impressive military record. Kamal served with distinction at Gallipoli and in Palestine, ending the war in command of the Ottoman 7th Army. But, unfortunately for the Ottoman government, he was also a nationalist, so instead of following his orders to put down the nationalist rebels, Kamal set about arming and organizing them, and even encouraged other military leaders to abandon the Ottoman government in favor of the nationalist cause. On September 4th, the nationalists held the Sivas Congress. Interestingly, the Ottomans tried to arrest Kamal on his way there, but the plot was foiled. There, the nationalist agenda was officially adopted, with the Congress becoming their official executive body. In doing so, they had just committed to fighting 3 of the world's great powers, multiple local powers, and even their own government. So you can call me Ezekiel. And this is the Turkish War of Independence. But first, this video is sponsored by Atlas VPN, which you can check out via the link in the description. The armies of the Turkish War of Independence all knew the importance of keeping their plans a secret. As we'll soon see, surprise played a key role in many of the most decisive victories of the war. Isn't your own data and privacy just as important? Government, monopolistic internet service providers, and hackers are trying to hurt you and steal your data every day. Protect it with Atlas VPN. Atlas VPN doesn't just protect your privacy and secure your data, because it also blocks ads, protects you from malicious links, trackers, and even informs you when someone's trying to steal your data. You can even use it to watch other countries' streaming services, or your own country's streaming service when abroad. Atlas VPN has over 750 servers in dozens of countries around the world, works on all your devices, and there's no limit to how many devices you can protect with it. Atlas VPN has over 4.5 stars on both Google Play and the Apple App Store, and is offering one of the best deals on the market today. With our special link, you can get Atlas VPN Premium for just $1.70 a month and 6 months free. There's even a 30-day money-back guarantee. Now you have nothing to lose. So have a private Christmas and a safe new year with Atlas VPN Premium by clicking the link in this video's description. You'll both get an amazing product and really help out our channel. And now, back to the video. Internal politics were not the only challenge confronting the nationalists. In the West, their soldiers started fighting with the Greeks who had landed in the area. The nationalists were very poorly equipped, though, and had to rely on irregular forces for support. This was inadequate for dealing with the 60,000 experienced Greek soldiers in the area. Luckily, the Ottoman government began to ignore the Allies' insistence on demobilizing, and began to join the fight. At this time, Greece was led by Prime Minister Venizelos, a figure so influential that nearly all of Greek politics revolved around Venizelist and anti-Venizelist factions. The main question of the day was how to best achieve the Megali idea. This was the plan for a greater Greece with territory spanning across both sides of the Aegean, and its capital in Constantinople. But Greece was neither particularly stable nor rich at the time, so Venizelos was careful not to overextend. The British, however, had their own agenda, and so promised to support the Greeks if they pursued a more aggressive policy. This convinced Venizelos to support the expansionist position. But the British weren't doing any of this out of love for the Greek people or a desire to achieve the Megali idea. They wanted Constantinople for themselves. On March 16, 1920, the British and French put Constantinople under military occupation, forcing the Sultan to install a puppet government. The nationalists responded by electing a national assembly based in Ankara, which convened for the first time on April 23rd. There, they elected Kemal as their first president. To add insult to injury, the Treaty of Sèvres was issued to the Ottomans with a 1-month deadline to accept. It involved the creation of a massive Armenian state, which could be expanded to reach as far as the Mediterranean, would see the Aegean Islands, Izmir, and the entire southwest go to Greece, and give Italy the Dodecanese Islands, the city of Antalya, and the surrounding area. Meanwhile, the straits around Constantinople would be supervised by an international commission. Finally, the Ottomans would be forced to pay reparations and to reduce their army to a little over 50,000 men. And, as if any of that wasn't bad enough, while the treaty was being negotiated, the Greeks launched their first offensive. On June 22, 1920, Greek armies launched dual offensives to expand their territory north and east. By July 10th, they had taken far more ground than they had initially expected to, and followed up this success by seizing eastern Thrace in July. Over the course of these campaigns, Greek discipline broke down as troops forced local Muslim and Jewish communities out of their homes, killing many of them in the process. This was part of a trend of increasingly serious atrocities committed by nearly all factions during the conflict. Frustrated by the Ottomans stalling the signing of the treaty, the Greeks decided to launch another offensive. It made limited gains, but the nationalists ended it with their own moderately successful counterattack. This was an early sign that the nationalist army was improving. But, as it turned out, the greatest threat to the Greek mission was not the nationalists, but their own internal politics and a Barbary macaque. On October 2nd, in a freak accident, King Alexander of Greece was bitten by a monkey and died. Venizelos tried and failed to put the dead king's son, Paul, on the throne. The Greek people then decided that this would be a great time to vote Venizelos out of power, and to replace him with the even more expansionist anti-Venizelists. This government chose to put King Constantine on the throne, who had been the king of Greece before but was forced to abdicate during World War I due to his pro-German sentiments. Putting a pro-German king in charge of Greece turned out to be a bad idea though, because it alienated the allies who the Greeks were relying on to support their Anatolia campaign. All of this political chaos in Greece convinced the allies that the Greeks were not the best partner in the region. And, since it was looking like the Bolsheviks were going to win the Russian Civil War, they needed someone in the region to act as a bulwark against communism. The Allies started to consider the Ottomans, or even the nationalists, for this position. But none of that deterred the anti-Venizelists. They reorganized the invasion force, renaming it to the Field Army of Asia Minor, or FAAM, and removing 1,500 experienced officers for their pro-Venizelos sympathies. Removing those experienced officers would turn out to have some negative consequences down the line, though. The new government launched their first major offensive on January of 1921, calling it a reconnaissance in force. The idea was not to take ground, but to test the strength of the nationalists. It was a bit of an odd move though, because the nationalists gained just as much intelligence from it as the Greeks did. And, to the rest of the world, it looked like the Greeks had just failed a major offensive. But that was cold comfort to the nationalists. By now, the Greeks were the least of their concerns. In the east, new enemies were revealing themselves. A small Armenian state had declared itself in the east. If left alone, the Allies would likely grant it large portions of Anatolia. That was something which the nationalists would never tolerate. They began amassing troops on the Armenian border, and launched their offensive on September 28, 1920. The war would be fought in 3 phases. The first phase was to take the town of Sarakamis, the second to take the fortress town of Kars, and the third was to clear out the remains of the Armenian army. If you couldn't already tell, this war went poorly for the Armenians. The initial nationalist attack was a huge success, with most of the Armenian army being taken by surprise. Armenian defenses collapsed in a matter of hours, while the nationalist cavalry was able to penetrate as far as 30 kilometers into Armenia in just the first day. This forced the Armenians to retreat, leaving large amounts of weapons and equipment behind them. The Armenian government responded by mobilizing their entire military-age population and courting international support, but neither would count for much. As the nationalists continued to stack up victories, the Russian Red Army invaded Armenia from the other side. The Armenian government negotiated a separate peace agreement with the nationalists that would allow them to keep their independence. But, since the Russians weren't included in these negotiations, the treaty was moot. The Red Army took over the rest of Armenia and turned it into an SSR. The nationalists and Soviets then signed their own treaty, establishing their mutual border. This meant that not only was the Eastern Front a total victory for the nationalists, but they were also able to create friendly relations with the Russians, freeing up soldiers for the other fronts. Speaking of which, we still need to talk about the French. North of French Syria was the Anatolian region of Cilicia, which was under joint Franco-British occupation. Large numbers of Armenians sought refuge here, who the French welcomed and even armed. But Cilicia had the same ethnic problems as the rest of Anatolia, so ethnic conflicts quickly erupted between the newly armed Armenians and the Muslims. This forced the Muslims to secure their own weapons, mostly from the nationalists. All of this meant that the French and British were now embroiled in a guerrilla war. And by the French and British, I mostly mean the French, because in the fall of 1919, the 48,000 British and Indian soldiers were ordered to leave Cilicia, leaving just the 20,000 French soldiers to defend the region. Soon, Kamal's government set its own sights on Cilicia. Hostilities would begin at the town of Maras after the French tried and failed to prevent conflict between its Armenian and Muslim populations. On January 21st, the nationalists besieged the town. 22 days later, on February 11th, the starving French broke out of the encircled city and fled. Thousands of Armenians tried fleeing with them, but many were killed in the process. The remaining Armenians were then interned, but they didn't face any further reprisals. The next focus point of the conflict was over the town of Pazanti. This town was essential to controlling the rail tunnel connecting Cilicia to Istanbul, where the French were getting their supplies. But the nationalist militias beat the army to it by tearing up the railroad behind French lines. The French forces at Pazanti were hard-pressed, and were supposed to be relieved by an armored train. But whoops, the nationalists destroyed the railroad, so the relief attempt failed, and the Pazanti garrison was forced to surrender. The summer of 1920 would continue to be a disaster for the French. Arab nationalists in Syria were beginning to gain momentum, and the same force occupying Cilicia was also responsible for Syria. Both sides agreed to a truce, and even to a French withdrawal, but that withdrawal never happened, because after the Syria situation was dealt with, the French launched a massive counterattack against the nationalists, and retook a lot of lost territory. But by this time, the nationalists had their hands full with the Greeks, so they couldn't do much about it. But the nationalists weren't that worried about France anyway. They knew that her empire was overextended. With the Polish-Soviet War intensifying, the French couldn't both occupy Cilicia and support the Poles, forcing the French to evacuate Cilicia and settle for Syria and Lebanon as their Middle Eastern empire. On October 20th, 1920, France and the nationalists signed the Treaty of Ankara, formally ending the Franco-Turkish War. The Turks got all of Cilicia, except for a sliver in Antakya, which the Turks wouldn't have returned to them until 1939. But the biggest losers here were the Armenians. The nationalists had promised to protect them, but up to 250 Christians evacuated the region anyway. And so, the nationalists have defeated both the Armenians and the French, but neither would prove to be nearly as dangerous as the Greeks, who were now funneling hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Anatolia, all in preparation for a march on Ankara. So will the Greeks secure their gains in Anatolia, or even realize the Magali idea? How will the nationalists resist a Greek army hundreds of thousands strong? And will the British ever keep a promise to a foreign power? Find out all of this and more in Part 2. Which, when it's out, you'll be able to watch by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. This video was funded by our supporters on Patreon and elsewhere, including Josiah, as well as by this video's sponsor, Atlas VPN. Links to where you can support us, our sponsor, and our sources can be found in the description. I'll see you in Part 2.